Agile and Scrum in a nutshell. Presented by Agile In. For more information, please check out our website. Today we're going to be learning about teaching a specific Agile methodology. So as an Agile coach, one of the models that we like to follow is called the Shu-Ha-Ri learning model. Shu-Ha-Ri is follow, innovate, transcend. So the idea is that it's best for students to first learn something and then follow those rules by the book. Now in Agile, as we'll find out in a moment, there is no specific set of rules for Agile, but there are for, say, Scrum or Kanban. So in order to teach students by the book, as an Agile coach, you basically have to know a methodology stone cold. So this presentation is an example of what you might want to be able to do as an Agile coach, whether it's this material as an Agile In Agile coach or your own material. You need to be able to quickly and articulately describe a methodology by the book very quickly. So beyond follow, of course, there's innovate. Once somebody has shown that they can follow the rules by the book, then since they understand what they're doing, they can start to break the rules, introduce new ideas, finally transcend. Agile has become second nature for the learner. So first let's start with Agile. Now many people conflate Agile and Scrum together as though they're the same, but they really are separate. Agile is anything that supports the principles and values of the Agile Manifesto. So here is the Agile Manifesto. We're not going to go through it in detail. You can learn more about it at agilemanifesto.org. However, you will see if you look at it closely that there is no mention of Scrum, there's no mention of Kanban, there's no mention of XP, there's no burn-ups or burn-downs. There's no step-by-step methodology in here of how to be Agile. So from the Agile Manifesto, we have a number of people that are like-minded. That's the Agile community, people that believe in the principles and values of the Agile Manifesto. That Agile community has over time created an Agile toolkit, including things like Scrum, user stories, continuous integration, and many more. So again, Agile is an adjective that describes anything that supports the values and principles of the Agile Manifesto. So you can do Scrum without being Agile, but it's hard to be Agile without doing things like Scrum and user stories. One of the most important things about Agile and Scrum is a focus on value. So let's look at a quick example. So here we have a movie-going planner like, say, Flickster, Fandango, and in order to break it up into small pieces and deliver value quickly, we need some way to do that. So the first thing about this is thinking of large chunks of value that are smaller than your overall vision. So in this case, we call them epics. An epic is any large chunk of value which typically breaks down into multiple stories. It can take many epics to create a full product vision. So if you look at this example, what theaters are near me, there are a lot of ways to display and understand what theaters are near me. It may be a listing, it could be a map, it could use GPS, it could use a zip code that you type in. But that whole area is a chunk of value that produces value all by itself. It's not a set of features and functions. It's not framework or anything like that. It's not infrastructure that you're building up for the full solution. It's value you can provide all by itself. Purchasing tickets, you might think, well, I can't split that out, but you could imagine having an app that you type in the theater you want to go to, the showtime, and the movie. Maybe you're at the theater, standing in front of all that information, and you just want to cut the line and pay. So purchasing tickets, whether by credit card or PayPal or gift certificates, that has value all by itself. That's the basic idea of an epic. Now, implementing an epic takes a long time, and doing a whole bunch of epics to do the whole product could take a long time. So what can we put out early? So the first concept we want to look at here is something that at Agile In we like to call the minimum viable increment. You'll see this concept out there in other ways, minimum viable product, minimum marketable feature, things like that. Very similar, not quite the same. We're going to focus on minimum viable increment. So in this example, if we create an app that has what theaters are near me, the movies and showtimes at a theater, what's playing near me, that takes both show time and distance into account. So for instance, show me the movies that I can get to, that are coming up soon that I can get to and get a good seat. That has value. And maybe the details, navigation, and purchasing tickets I'll do later. So that'll be the first version of my product. We'll call that the minimum viable increment. And then I'll do increments after that. Now beyond that, once I figure that out and I have my epics, then I'm going to break my epics down into user stories. So in this case, I'm showing all 6 epics broken down into user stories. But if I was doing a minimum viable increment, I would just break down those first 3. I might do some stories from some of the other epics as I break down those stories and realize there's value in some of the other epics. You don't have to go epic by epic. But now that I've broken things down into user stories, I kind of want to forget about the epics. They're a good framing device, but if I focus on the epic and doing the whole epic, I might do something in one epic that doesn't have a lot of value compared to a story in another epic. So I want to focus on user stories once I get to that point. Now, what is a user story? Now, unfortunately, I've seen a number of user stories that are stories in name only, right? So for instance, you might have a requirement document of 20 pages, and somebody has understood that it needs to be in the form of as a I want so that. So they'll insert a new line at the top and put as a something, I want something, so that something, but the requirement actually stays the same. But that's not a user story. A user story is a very short expression of the value that you're trying to produce, that has a who is it for, what is it that we're going to do for that user or that market or that customer, and why are we doing it? Why do they want it? What is the purpose? If you can't describe who, what, and why, one might ask, why are you doing it? You don't know who it's for, you don't know why you're doing it. Knowing what, that's great. We've always known the what. But in Agile, we want to focus on the value. Now, this short description, you might think that's not enough to actually implement. I get that. But if you have 100 user stories, and it turns out you're only going to have time to implement 20 of them, elaborating on the other 80 is actually a waste of time. So once you've figured out the high value stories, you can elaborate those further, and that's a talk for another day. But a user story has a who, a what, and a why. Now, who's going to do these user stories? That's an Agile team. So what is an Agile team? Well, first off, if we're going to work on small pieces of value, we're going to deliver them really quickly, because that's part of the Agile value system, then we need a team that can do that. It can't be a team of just developers and then a team of just testers. It needs to be a cross-functional team, a group of people that has everything needed to get that work out the door. So it's not that you have an architect, but that you have people with architecture skills on the team. It's not that you have necessarily a QA person or a tester, but that you have people with testing skills on the team. Now, you very may well have a person that is called a developer and a person called a tester, but at the end of the day, this team needs to have all the skills to get the work ahead of them out the door. Now, another important point that comes from Agile is that people work best when they understand each other, when they trust each other. So if you're going to try to get something out the door on a regular cadence, say every 2 weeks, those people need to be able to work together very smoothly, because any little problem is going to be a hiccup, which is going to delay getting that work done. So Bruce Tuckman came up with this model that's been really proved itself out, called the Tuckman model, which he says, and I think you'll notice that this is something that you're familiar with, that when a team is formed or a new person is added or a team member is removed, people go through a forming stage. Like, who are we as a team? Who does what? Then storming. People argue, they have disagreements, they haven't quite figured out how to work together. Now in Agile we would say, let's put together a working agreement, and that's something for another day, but how are we going to work together to get to a place where we can perform well? So people go through these stages: forming, storming, norming, and then finally performing. Unfortunately, in many traditional projects, a team is formed, the project is done, the team disperses. So it's hard for people to actually get to norming, let alone performing. But that's part of the key thing. If we're going to do things quickly, we need to be at the performing stage, because going through forming and storming, we're never going to be able to get things done in a short period of time. Okay, So we've been talking about Agile and value. Let's get very specifically into Scrum now. This is just a quick introduction to Scrum, but this is something that as an Agile coach, you need to know stone cold and be able to quickly articulate. One of the primary things behind Scrum is that without Scrum, a normal situation is that you have the team and they have a barrage of incoming requests. This customer wants something, that customer wants something. You've got stakeholders coming directly to developers and tapping them on the shoulder and saying, hey, could you do this? I'll do something special for you. Horse trading, all that kind of stuff. It's very disruptive to that team, actually. And if a developer decides to do this piece of work over that piece of work based on people tapping them on the shoulder, that developer has just made a business decision. Well, who should be making the business decisions? Scrum says it should be a product owner. Now, product owner is something that sometimes has been morphed into product manager and is not a true product owner. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But, and this is a brief introduction to the concept of a product owner. We'll get into more details. But the product owner, or at Agile In, we like to also introduce the idea of a team backlog owner, that it is the same one person throughout the entire project. If there is a separate product management function, that they have an excellent rapport with the product manager, that the product owner has team-level decision-making. They're making decisions closer to the work. They're empowered to make that decision. They're not going to get countermanded. Now, that only works if they've worked closely with all the stakeholders, but they have the power to make that decision on behalf of the team. So the team is shielded from all of that upfront work, all of that horse trading and that kind of stuff. Somebody that's been empowered to make those business decisions is going to be making those business decisions. Now, the product owner needs to be very knowledgeable. They need to answer questions regarding the team's work for the iteration immediately most of the time, within a few hours delay, once in a while. So one of the great tools in Agile and Scrum is something called a backlog. A backlog is work ordered from highest value to lesser value. And you put stories together in the backlog to determine what your release is. So if you have a certain window of time, the amount of work off the backlog that you can get done in that time, that's actually going to be the content of your release. So the idea is that you have a product owner who is specifying the order of the work to be done, and as new work comes in, the product owner with stakeholders figures out where exactly does this story fit. At the top, in the middle, further down, in the next release. Now, if it's right on the bubble, that's hard. But now that we've quickly reviewed the work and it's in English and it's easy to understand, maybe we've noticed a story that can be knocked out to preserve that release date. So the next concept is an iteration, also known as sprints. I'm going to refer to them as iterations in this presentation. An iteration is a brief period of time, say 1 to 4 weeks, which is set and kept on a regular basis. You set up a regular cadence. So if you pick 2 weeks, then you stick to 2 weeks. 3 weeks, you stick to 3 weeks. You don't change it every sprint, right? It's a hard cadence that you set and stick to so that you can get good at it. Many things depend on that cadence. We'll be talking upcoming about velocity. So if it changes, it makes things very unpredictable. So pick an iteration length and stick to it. You might need to experiment a little bit when you're getting used to it, but once you've settled on something, stick with it. So within an iteration, you pick the amount of work that you think you can get done within that point of time, and then you make no changes and you go forward with that work. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But the idea is at the end of each iteration, you have actual deliverable work. Now you might think, oh, okay, well, I don't know what projects you've worked on. They must have been small. We work on big, complicated projects. Now in the beginning, it may be difficult to every iteration have something shippable, but that is absolutely the goal. That's one of the things that makes Agile and Scrum hard, is to be able to deliver on a regular basis, real work that the customer cares about. Now, doing things the traditional way, it would be hard to do that, but Agile also brings in a lot of technical practices, which is a topic for another day, but you will actually have to do things differently to fit into this, but it's worth it. So The next concept is story points. Now, not everybody using Scrum uses story points, but many people using Scrum use story points. So we're going to talk about story points. Story points, what is a story point? Well, there's a number of facets to story points to understand before it makes sense altogether. But let's start out here. It's a measure of relative complexity. It's not hours. It's not based on who's going to do the work. You're saying this work is about twice as much as that work, right? So you're taking into account all the work of the team. How much work will it be for the team to get some piece of work done, including the coding, the configuring, the testing, the technical documentation, on and on. All the work needed to get that out to the customer. It doesn't include dependencies. So if you're going to do two stories and one has one estimate and one has another estimate and one depends on the other, then you just add them up, and that's the total time to get all of that done. And it's independent of who does the work. Now the thing about it is, relative complexity is unlikely to change over time. You may get better at doing something, but that means that the other stories are still going to be some relative measure more complex than the other stories. Okay, so let's look at an example of the typical work of the team. So this may be for a whole release, it may be a couple of iterations, and these stories, the work for the team is sized according to the area, right? So a larger area box, that means more work, smaller is less work. So let's lay it out like this, just take a look at the work, and we'll notice that some work is small, some is big, and if we look at it a little differently, we sort it this way, you can see that there's a group of work that's all about the same size and looks like about the smallest amount of work for the team to do. Now this is including all the work the team needs to do. So each of those pieces of work is a story that has value to a customer, and it's the coding, the configuring, the testing, etc. So we'll call that a 1. We don't know how much time it's going to take to do. That's not important yet. We'll call the others 2, 3, and 5. So a 2 means that you can do, that it's twice as much effort for the team to get it done as a 1. So a team can either get a 2-point story done or 2 1-point stories done, 1 5-point story done, or 5 1-point stories done, etc. So it is the relative complexity, and the numbers are multipliers. Now you might ask, why the gap there? Why not a 4-point story? Well, we're trying to ballpark here. This is just to get a best guess out there so we can do some planning. However long it takes somebody to actually do a story, that's how long it's actually going to take. All right, so the next concept is velocity. We need to understand how much work can we get done in an iteration of work. So for instance, if it's 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of work. And it's going to take a while to calibrate that exactly. This is measuring how much you got done. Just like in your car, you're measuring with the speedometer, how fast are you going? So let's say we have 3 iterations. In the first iteration, we get a bunch of stories done, and if we add up the story points, it's 21 points. The next one, it's 17. The next one, it's 22. It looks like the team on a regular basis can do somewhere around 20 points. So we're going to call that their velocity. Now, it doesn't mean that every iteration after that they're going to get 20 done, but if they planned on 40 for the next iteration, it's unlikely they'd complete it. And if they only plan on 5, they're probably going to have extra time. Okay, so we have iterations. We figured out what our velocity is, our capacity is. Now, the first thing that we do within an iteration is we do the planning. Now this planning is the planning for the work that we're going to do for this iteration. We may have done other planning to get to this point, but today we're just talking about the planning within an iteration. So that's called iteration planning. In the iteration planning meeting, you have a number of stories that the product owner has gotten to the point of ready. What is ready? It's whatever you've defined it as. So generally that's things like the stories have a well-defined who, what, why, they have acceptance criteria, that sort of thing. So the product owner is responsible for making stories hit the definition of ready. So we have here a backlog, which is a combination of ready stories, not ready stories. We have a team, they have a certain capacity measured by the velocity. And in the iteration planning meeting, what we're going to do is the team is going to say, we agree that these stories are ready, and pull in stories of the same size as their capacity. Once they've done that, they may then test the stories out, they may assign who's going to work on what story, but the basic idea of iteration planning is to decide what stories that are ready is this team going to accomplish this iteration that matches their capacity. After they've pulled those stories out, then the backlog is adjusted and the product owner will continue to work on grooming the backlog for the future. Next, that iteration is locked. That means that we're not going to change what stories are in there, we're not going to take them out, we're not going to add. Now, reality may intrude and you may need to do something a little bit differently, but by default, you want to not change the contents of that iteration. The next thing, once you've got started and you know what you're going to do, is every day the team will get together in what's called a daily stand-up meeting. So in the daily stand-up meeting, there's basically 3 questions in Scrum that we're going to ask to make sure we're on track. Each person will say what they did since the last meeting for this team, for this iteration. So for instance, they'll say, I worked on this story, I got it done, and next I'm going to work on that story. And then finally, the third question is, what impediments do you see for this team, for this iteration? So that could be regarding your work, other work, things that are going to get in the way of the team finishing for this iteration. Everybody goes around very quickly. Now, you may be tempted during those 3 questions to get into a discussion. The idea is we want to hold that till the end. And this is really just work for this team, for these stories, based on what we've pulled in for this iteration. Anything else, some meeting you have to go to, a vacation day or whatever, those are all considered impediments. Now, taking a vacation day, that's fine, but if it was unplanned, it's really an impediment. So the team needs to figure out, what are we going to do now that this unplanned vacation day came up, or somebody's out sick, or there's a high priority bug that we have to fix for somebody else. That's an impediment. The next idea is that you want to track your progress throughout the iteration so you know where you are. That makes the stand-up meetings even more pointed. If it looks like no progress is being made and nobody's mentioning any impediments, then you know something's wrong. So this is just an example. People use all kinds of different ways to measure progress and all kinds of different designs of card walls. This is one card wall. In the beginning of the iteration, you have a bunch of stories to do, so they're in the to-do column. Over the course of the iteration, you're going to have stories that are in the progress of being implemented, in the process of being tested, ready to accept, and finally done. So we're also using a burn-up chart, and there's burn up, burn down by story points, hours remaining, etc. This one is a burn up by story points associated with done stories. So I have set a target of 20 points for this iteration. I believe I'm going to get stories totaling 20 points done this iteration. On the 3rd day, I got a 3-point story done, so I have 3 points done. That's great. Now I have a trend line that I'm not quite at, but maybe I have some stories in progress that are going to finish up tomorrow. So I'm going to use the trend line and the burn-up chart and the card wall to measure my progress. As I go along, I'm going to get more and more stories to done until finally, at the end, on the last day of the iteration, I should have all of my stories done. If I don't, there's an issue. But this allows me to see, where am I? At the end of the iteration, in Scrum, we do an iteration review. That's, did we do what we said we were going to do? So the team will go story by story and show to the customers, the product manager, the product owner, other stakeholders, this is what we said we would do, and see, we did it. Or we didn't do it. But this is a final review to see where we are. What did we get done? What did we not get done? And also to get feedback. There's sometimes a temptation to call this a demo, but in a demo you're demonstrating, you're trying to sell. Iteration review is much better because we're trying to get feedback on what we've done to make sure we're on course. And then we're going to take that feedback into the next iteration. Once we've done an iteration review, we do a retrospective. So we know what we plan to do, we've been having our stand-ups, we've been doing our work, we had our iteration review. We have a good sense of how well we did over the past iteration. In the retrospective, we're going to look back and see all the great things we did and maybe the not so great things, and we're going to figure out how could we be better in the next iteration. And we're going to have our definition of ready, which is just a description of whether a story is ready or not to do. Our definition of done, which is how we understand if a story is actually done. And maybe we need to change them. Maybe we think, you know, we ran into a lot of things that a code review could have fixed. Why don't we add that the story has been code reviewed to our definition of done? In any case, you may come up with a lot of action items. You don't have to fix them all right away, but pick at least one and try to get at least one done every iteration, some change that you need to make or want to make in order to get to the point of being able to complete everything that you said you were going to complete every iteration. That's the goal. So next, there's a concept called co-location. Now, co-location, it sounds like we're going to take our whole team and put them in one place. And if you have a group of 100 people, that may be hard to do. Companies want to be able to get the talent where the talent lives, and so that means that you may not be able to be all in one place. So what does co-location really mean? It means that if you have these small teams, 5 to 9 people, you want to try to organize the people geographically close to each other into teams. If you can do it, great. If you can't, to the extent that you can, you'll get more focus from each team as they are more co-located. And the idea of co-location is that if we're together, communication is going to come quickly, we can focus on the tasks at hand, and we can be much more productive and efficient. Now, it's not always possible, but another thing that this is pointing out is that you can only be co-located on one team simultaneously for the focus, but there are other ways to get that focus. So another example is we have these teams. We have 4 teams. Each of them has a backlog, and the people on those teams are going to be working on just that one team. So as an individual on a team, I'm not spread across projects, I'm not spread across teams, I have one team. I may be working as a team on multiple projects, but all the work for an individual iteration is going to be in the backlog for that iteration, and that's all that we as a team will work on that iteration. If you need me to work on something else, it's going to have to be in the next iteration. So in that case, I'm going to have focus via the backlog, and the team members can be spread wherever they need to be, but they should still be working on one team with one backlog. Now, we've been talking about individual iterations and planning for individual iterations. Scrum focuses on one iteration at a time. What if I need to plan out a larger release? Well, that's pretty straightforward. You can do planning for more iterations in advance if you want to, but the idea is that you're targeting content for different iterations for an overall release. What actually happens in practice depends on what you get done every iteration, what comes up in the iteration review, and changes that you make to the plan iteration by iteration. But in any case, let's say you have a team that has an iteration length of 2 weeks. They have a velocity of 20 points per iteration. So if you want to release 60 points worth of stories, that's going to be 6 weeks. So planning is pretty straightforward. You can either say, I want this work, and based on their velocity, it's going to be 6 weeks, or you can say, I want this work done, how long is it going to take? So we talked a little bit about the product owner, or as we like to say, team backlog owner. Now, Scrum says product owner. The only reason we suggest team backlog owner is that sometimes the product owner is actually the product manager. So the team still needs somebody that's focused on them, iteration after iteration. So in this discussion, we'll just talk about the product owner as somebody that's focused on the team. You know that you have a product owner when they are the same person throughout the entire project. They have an excellent rapport with product management or the business. They attend all iteration planning meetings. They've got at least 2 iterations of stories ready at all times. They are empowered to do team-level decision-making. They attend all iteration planning meetings, and they're knowledgeable about what needs to be done. So if you ask them a question about a story for this iteration, they'll give you that answer right away or a couple of times, because things come up, a few hours delay once in a while. But that's what a product owner is, and this is a vital role. Some companies are tempted to appoint people, but you want to make sure you go through that whole typical hiring process you would for any other role, even if it's an internal person that you're going to be putting into that role. Another important role in Scrum, we have the product owner, we also have the Scrum Master. So what is a Scrum Master? And again, you don't want to appoint this person. You want to go through the whole interview process to make sure that you have somebody that wants to do the role, that is capable of doing the role, and choose the right person for the spot. So I'm not going to go through all of the points here. You can read it, but it's somebody who is becoming an Agilist, somebody that believes in the Agile principles and values of the manifesto and is able to explain them. This is a profession all by itself, right? So it's a specific set of skills, and it's often a full-time role, possibly serving one or more teams. This person is usually not serving as a people manager or product owner, and they have skills such as being a servant leader, facilitation. There's somebody who is going to shepherd the Agile process. There are many responsibilities of a Scrum Master. So, in summary, here is the Scrum cycle all in one place. You have a product vision. You're going to break that product vision down into a backlog of work. Every iteration, you look at what's the highest value work that we could do for this product vision on the backlog, and we're going to implement that, an iteration at a time. And what's most important to do for that product vision may change iteration to iteration. So we have the product vision, we have the product backlog, we have iterations, we have the team, the small cross-functional team that is as co-located as we can get, or working on just one backlog. We have the product owner, the Scrum Master. At the beginning of each iteration, we're going to do iteration planning, figure out which stories will be in our iteration backlog. We're going to have a stand-up every day. We're going to track our progress, perhaps using a burn-up by story points, perhaps some other method. We might have a card wall. At the end of each iteration, we're going to have a shippable increment of work. So that shippable increment of work is shippable, doesn't mean we have to ship it every iteration. It's our choice. We're going to have an iteration review to make sure that we've done what we said we were going to do, or get feedback that will feed into the next iteration. Finally, we'll do our retrospective to see how we can improve. And then we just keep going until either the product owner has decided that's enough, my product vision is good, let's move on to some other product or some other project. Or it may be something very large that the company wants to, or the organization wants to invest in over a long period, and so you just keep going and going. All right, so one more important point, and I've mentioned this a couple of times. Each team member is hopefully working on just one team, and the team is working against just one backlog. Now there may be some exceptions, but that's the goal. Perhaps the Scrum Master or the product owner is working on multiple teams, but each team should have the same Scrum Master. Each team, the Scrum Master for that team should always be the same Scrum Master all the time. Same for the product owner. We don't want to be switching up Scrum Master and product owner all the time. So the other important thing to understand here is the schedule. This gives a real clear idea of what we're talking about here. So for instance, a developer or a QA person on that team, they're going to be going to, on average, 3 hours and 15 minutes of Scrum meetings per week. It might be a little bit more in the beginning, might become a little less over time, but that's, if it's a 2-week iteration, 1 hour of iteration planning in the beginning, a stand-up for 15 minutes every day, an iteration review of an hour at the end, a retrospective of an hour right after that, and all other time is uninterrupted work. There may be other meetings that we have to have, but any meetings that we can replace with a stand-up, iteration planning, iteration review, or retrospective, that's what we want to do. Okay, this has just been a brief Agile in a nutshell presentation. If you want to discover more about Agile, Agile coaching, Agile In, or Scrum, there's all kinds of information on our website at eliason.com. Thank you very much for your time.